like the bubbles in a glass of champagne.
The events in Europe were later described by Winston Churchill as a gathering storm. But in the last few weeks of September, in the tropical Atlantic, a very real storm was developing. Within a few hours on the afternoon of September the 21st, it would change these beaches into scenes of horror and tragedy. The great hurricane would claim many of these lives and radically alter the face of New England.
The moon of Manacura.
We have become familiar with the image of the Earth spinning silently beneath us from space. The whirlpools and eddies of the atmosphere forming and dispersing like mist. Today, during the hurricane season, the slightest disturbance in the tropical weather patterns is monitored and tracked and becomes a part of the reassuring chatter of electronic journalism. But in the 1930s, there was no early warning system because there was no radar, no weather satellite orbiting overhead, and no dinnertime television weatherman to alarm or reassure us. If a hurricane formed, we got our information about its position from the skirts of the storm, from ships who were trying their best to avoid it. We thus knew more about where an approaching storm wasn't than where it was. The hurricane of 1938 was first reported on September 18th, moving toward Florida at a leisurely 12 miles an hour. During the coming war, American soldiers would name storms after their wives or sweethearts, but the Weather Service did not adopt the practice until the 50s. So this storm, one of the most destructive on record, had no name. In order to understand why this particular storm was to be so deadly, we have to look briefly at how hurricanes live and die. No one knows exactly what triggers a hurricane, but one can occur when a vertical break is formed in the band of easterly winds blowing across the hot equatorial seas. A low-pressure area forms and deepens. The trade winds turn in on themselves and spiral upwards. If this motion intensifies, the result may become a hurricane, a huge flat spiral of winds pumping heat upwards through a calm eye. In cross-section, it is as complex as a chambered seashell and as full of trouble as an apartment house. Rain falls in bands. Lightning plays constantly through the structure, all of it whipped by turbulent winds. The hurricane winds circle counterclockwise, so they are strongest where their direction is the same as the hurricane's as it moves forward. Here, the forward speed of the hurricane is added to the velocity of its own screaming winds. Even more dangerous are the waves and tides generated by the hurricane. These, too, are worse on the right leading shoulder of the storm. The surface of the ocean is sucked upwards just slightly under the hurricane, like liquid in a straw, and is pushed along in a dome or swell as the hurricane advances. If the hurricane hits the coast, the rising continental shelf lifts this vast dome of water into a towering surge that may be 20 feet high when it crosses the shoreline. These satellite loops show the track of a hurricane whose path is similar to that of the 1938 storm. The hurricane makes a feint toward Florida and then turns northward along the southern coast. Here, a hurricane might be expected to increase its speed to about 30 miles per hour and then turn northeast, out to sea. What was unusual about the 1938 storm was the speed it gained. This storm was rolling now at nearly 60 miles an hour, and it had turned north. It was racing straight for New England. What were the people who lived and worked along the northeast coast doing to prepare? virtually nothing. In New England, tropical storms were rarer than palm trees, and the last really powerful hurricane to have struck the area hit more than 100 years before. That was the Great Gale of 1815. There was nobody alive who remembered it. Even if there had been accurate warnings of the storm's approach, it would have been a rare man then who would have heard or believed them.
In those days, they never used to listen to weather reports. In fact, I don't ever remember my father listening to a weather report. They'd look at the sky in the evening before and tap the berm in the morning and see what the sunset looked like and take it from there. Nowadays, if they don't get a weather report, well, everyone screams that the Weather Bureau isn't on the ball or the Coast Guard isn't on the ball. And I think if they'd warned the people of a hurricane at that time, they would have just considered it another line storm and let it go at that. Take it as it comes when it gets here.
We weren't used to keeping our radios on. We weren't looking for anything like that. And they said there was warnings, but evidently they weren't anything that any of us would be hearing. As I say, we naturally either have television or radio going all the time, mostly now. But in those days, you just tuned it in at night, the news of it. So I'm not certain they had a radio. I don't think they even had a radio.
At 8:30 on the morning of September 21st, the Hurricane Center was officially reported somewhere east of Cape Hatteras. At noontime, east of Virginia. High tides and gale winds were expected in Connecticut late that evening. In fact, the storm was hundreds of miles further north and roaring like a fast car toward the coast. Here was the danger. On this satellite photograph, you can see that Narragansett Bay is the first significant indentation in the Atlantic coastline north of Philadelphia. And it was here that the terrible right shoulder of the hurricane would strike. The long arms of the bay holding and squeezing the awful storm surge even higher. Most vulnerable of all were those delicate white lines. The barrier beaches of southern Rhode Island and Massachusetts, crowded with hundreds of summer homes and cottages. Late in the morning, the air was still clear. Some fishing boats had put out. At midday, picnics took place as scheduled. Some of those who went swimming, however, noticed something. The water was surprisingly warm. In the early afternoon, there was a faint yellowish tinge to the sky, and the wind began to pick up. Now, in the harbors and bays of New England, small trees began to shake, and boats at anchor began to toss uneasily. At 2 o'clock, anyone who happened to listen to a radio would have been told that the tropical storm was somewhere at sea off New Jersey. But by then it was too late. The great hurricane had already struck land.
Wind and rain lashed the Jersey coast and New York City, flooding the streets and rupturing steam pipes. Hundreds of miles north in Winchester, Massachusetts, the winds whipped the usually calm water of a reservoir into a chop and dashed waves up the embankments. At first, the rising wind and waves were a curiosity, and many people left safety to drive to the shore to watch what they thought would be an exciting surf. Some never returned. High tide was expected in the late afternoon, and that Wednesday was close to the autumnal equinox, the day that sun and moon combine to create the highest tides of the year. Riding in on top of the bellying swell of this double tide was the great storm surge of the hurricane. When it should have been low water, the ocean was already at high tide level, the water rising almost visibly minute by minute. Small boats pounded ashore or broke their moorings and went scudding inland over submerged lawns and fields. At Weekapaug and at Point Judith, 2 towns on Rhode Island's southern coast, Ella Ruick and Jack Westcott were trying to keep the driving water out of beachfront homes.
Well, I heard a crash upstairs, so I went up to investigate, and I found out that one of the large windows had been blown in one of the bedrooms. And I tried to fix it, you know, get something to hold up against it, but the wind would blow everything down, so I just had to give up. And I went downstairs, and by that time the water was on the floor of the dining room, and I thought it was leaking through the windows. And I looked out the window down there, and I see what seemed to be large black birds flying through the air, and it turned out to be the roof shingles coming off. And then as I was waiting there, I heard a knock at the back door. I went to the door and tried to open it, but there was so much suction in the house that it was almost impossible to open it. And so I didn't know until later that police were going from house to house to notify people to get out.
We came home from the school around 3:30 that day and went in the house. My father was home. He said there's quite a storm. He went fishing that morning. In fact, the whole fleet did. They didn't have any bad weather report. They didn't get many weather reports in those days anyway. And went in the living room, the water's pouring through all the south windows. So we went in the kitchen, got some pans and put down under the windows to catch the water, keep the floor from getting wet. And we soon found out we couldn't keep up with the water, so we rolled the rug back. My father went to the front door and opened the door, and he said, "My God, the breakers are on the porch. We better get out of here."
So I grabbed my raincoat and my handbag, and I got out of there. And as I say, the wind was blowing so hard that I practically had to almost walk on all fours. So I bent way over. If I hadn't, I would have been blown into the pond. I couldn't walk upright. And later, Mrs. Buffum told Mrs. Taylor that she saw this, but she thought it was a huge dog, and she paid no more attention to it.
The sea pounded at bulkheads and breakwaters. 20 miles inland, people could taste salt in the driving rain, and many along this coast began to realize that this was no simple nor'easter. Then the screw tightened. The wind literally screamed as its speed rose 60, 80, 120 miles an hour on the south coast. In the Blue Hills Observatory outside Boston, the instruments blew apart, but recorded the speed of the gust that destroyed them, 186 miles an hour. The ocean poured over the beaches and opened breachways across the sand, isolating many cottages and homes. People realized that their lives were in danger and that it was too late now to escape. They moved from room to room, floor to floor in their houses as the walls broke around them. All they could do was to hang on.
Went upstairs, and my first memory upstairs was seeing Daddy, and I can't remember who it was, trying to hold up the front door with the water was just cascading against it. It was just being pushed flat on top of it. And I remember those waves breaking there. Prior to that, I understand that the windows had been going, and the water was at that level. Then we went up to the second floor, where we gathered in a room that was situated at the back of the house, which was my father's. I do remember a side view looking out this way, which was where the house where the Nestors lived, right next to us. It was a very sturdy shingled house. And I remember very distinctly seeing the cook, who had always made me blueberry muffins, outside on the porch, and she got hysterical, and I do remember a wave coming towards the porch, and she jumped. She jumped into that wave, and her life was lost. I also remember standing at that window and seeing that house go, seeing the wave break over the house and the whole house go.
No one could stand in the wind. Scuttling on all fours or lying flat on the ground, those who looked out seaward saw a terrifying sight. The storm surge had arrived. A huge pulse in the height of the ocean, it was topped with real breaking waves, 10, 15, and 20 feet high. The wind had sliced off the crests of the waves and they became black rollers, running on a sea that was itself 10 feet higher than it had been for 120 years. The surge and the huge breakers washed over the coast with frightening swiftness. Buildings came apart like flimsy cardboard boxes, and the water rushing inland was a soup of timbers, spars, bits of wall, mattresses, rooftops, sheds, and thousands of playing cards.
When we reached the third floor, basically the house began to wash away under us. In fact, it was. It went out from under us, and there we were on the third floor with a little bit of the roof, which eventually broke off and went off on itself. There was a pipe that was coming up. I don't know why it was there, I think to hold the roof, but my father hooked his leg around that pipe and held on. Everybody held on to each other. I, being the littlest, was next to my father and under his coat, and I can remember very vividly the count of 1, 2, 3, duck, and a wave would break over us. 1, 2, 3, duck, and a wave would break over us. It seemed to me that it went on forever, but I guess it really didn't. We floated across. Well, my parents didn't know where we were going. They really thought we were headed for Block Island, and I can remember the excitement when they spotted Dennison's Rock, which is a buoy right out here. At that time, I didn't know what it meant. Now I know. That it meant that we were in the bay and we were headed for shore. We weren't being pushed out into the ocean.
Further up the bay, compressed by the narrowing shoreline, the waves were less powerful, but the water was rising even higher. Boathouses and yacht clubs shuddered, collapsed, or lifted free and sank. At the head of the bay in Providence, the water ran an incredible 13 feet above normal high tide. It rose over the banks of the river and rushed into the downtown area as office workers watched from second-story windows in disbelief. Sidewalks, then cars, then trolleys disappeared under the waves, their roofs like a series of lily pads in a pond. Above the wind, the jangling and blaring of burglar alarms and car horns as they shorted out. Roof shingles and shards of glass whipped by like shrapnel. Inland rivers and streams already filled from 3 days of rain during the week crested and overflowed. Hartford, Connecticut became a cluster of islands as men with sandbags worked feverishly into the night to protect what they could. In Tiverton and Newport, Rhode Island, in Westport, Fairhaven, New Bedford, and Woods Hole, Massachusetts, heaving seas, brutal winds, and water that kept rising. Ella Ruick had crawled from her cottage and had taken shelter with some workmen in the Weekapaug Inn, a huge, rambling building about 30 feet from the ocean.
The room that I was in was in the back of the inn. You couldn't see the ocean from it. You weren't facing the ocean. I could see along towards Quanticontog. But before that, I had gone down to one of the front windows, and I saw this huge wave come bashing against the inn, and I thought, well, that's just too much to watch, and decided to go up in the other little room and stay there. Mr. Wheeler came in, and the floor was buckling under me. The floor kept going up and down, and he asked me if that was really so, or was he the only one feeling it, because he may have thought that he was a little bit seasick or something. And I said, Mr. Wheeler, that is really happening. I said, that the floor is really buckling under me. But still, I felt calm about it, because I thought, well, if it does nothing but that, it isn't too bad.
Ellery Thompson made his way from Mystic to Stonington, Connecticut, to try to save his fishing boat.
Well, I was home there, around noontime on the 21st, and my car was broke down over in Delagrange's garage in Stonington, so I told my mother, I said, I'm going to take the bus to Stonington. And I was lucky to ever get to Stonington, because the storm kept increasing. On the way over, I could see the Mystic River, where the shoreline followed the coast then, and I never saw such savage whitecaps. I said, I never seen them as bad as that. And there was a pregnant woman on the bus, and luckily she got off at Stonington, because I was beginning to think, by God, what I knew about that, and I didn't know much. But she got off, and we continued on. I was the only passenger. And the bus just made Stonington when it all hemmed in. I got off, and I pretty had to crawl down from the green into the coffee pot restaurant. And the hurricane hadn't struck then. Its roof was going off, all the wheels were tipping over. It must have been going about 80 miles an hour. So we got in there, and a liquor store had broken open there, and the whiskey bottle was rolling down the street. So someone darted out and got a hold of a couple, brought it in, so we started drinking coffee royal, take the pain away. And then at 3 o'clock, I heard this ungodly screech. That was a hurricane. 170 miles an hour, right from 80 to 90. So I got to peek out. So the landlord let me go through his building so I could peek out the front windows. Couldn't see anything, so he had a door there. I could pretty much lost my arm. I opened the door and stepped out into a regular sheltered V. But when I did, the door slammed behind me, and if it ever took my arm off. And so down the dock, I saw the boats going one by one. My boat, the Eleanor, held it on the very last. Finally, she lay way out there and just one stern lying. Finally, that snapped. The building was gone, everything was gone, all but the Eleanor. She darted across the swept. She struck the other side, rolled over on the beam ends, and then everything all shut out. A mass of salt, and So when it lifted up and I could see, she was gone. I thought she was sunk, but she wasn't.
Then came the fires, one in Peterborough, New Hampshire, and another in New London, Connecticut, where fallen wires sparked flames which burnt the heart out of the business district by morning. Night fell, and the sky began to clear. Without power or telephones, the communities along the coast were isolated and surrounded by confusion and rumor. Whole towns had been washed away. Galilee was gone. Weekapaug was gone. Watch Hill was gone. In many cases, the rumors were true. For some of those who had survived along the coast, it was worse. Bruised and wounded, huddled in barns and ditches, they could look south and see the flames from New London against the night sky. It seemed like the end of the world. The headlines the next morning told only part of the story. The reality was much worse than anyone could yet imagine. Along the south shore of Long Island, great waves had scoured the beaches at the Hamptons and Amagansett. Transmission towers were down. Giant trees had fallen. Across the bay in Connecticut, the rest of the world discovered the wreck of the Bostonian out of New York. It had been missing since the day before. At the height of the storm, with the tracks awash and beginning to buckle under the train, the crew had uncoupled the last cars minutes before they slid into the bay. The engineer inched the train forward toward dry ground, dragging power lines and poles with it as it went. One last obstacle, the house lying across the tracks, was nudged aside by the engine. It sank out of sight in what was now deep water next to the track. One man who tried to swim to safety through the debris-choked water was struck by a floating beam and disappeared. Fisherman Ellery Thompson had found his boat, the Eleanor.
The next morning after a hurricane, no one could do anything at night. Everything was black. You just hold up wherever you could. So in the morning, I went out looking for my boat. So one of the Rhde boys said, she's up on the tennis court. So we went up there, and the pal, of course, lay right alongside of her. And I was amazed because all the planking had given way from the stem. There was a bare stem, and there wasn't one boat nail. There was one fastening. What had been keeping her afloat was just, I don't know, the pressure of the water. And the ones that had fished it could have been lost on her plenty of times the year before. But I looked through the hull. I looked through the hull for her to see if I could find a lost bottle of whiskey, because she was a notorious rum runner, see, in the 1920s.
New London and Stonington were choked with wreckage and littered with the remains of a large fishing fleet. But the worst destruction of all occurred on the southern beaches of Rhode Island. Nappertree Point had been a delicate spit of land stretching westward from Watch Hill. There was literally nothing left of the dozens of solid homes. Many of these people were swept across the bay to safety, but just as many had drowned. Weekapaug and Misquamicut before the storm. All that was left now were fragments of houses. Not even foundations remained. On these beaches alone, more than 100 people had perished. This was the Weekapaug Inn from which Ella Ruick had been rescued, a gaping hole torn in its side. Charlestown, Galilee, Sand Hill Cove. The scene was surreal. Survivors and sightseers straggled over the piles of sand, and disconsolate homeowners sat in shock on what used to be their front steps. Sometimes only a pitiful sink or bureau marked the site of their houses. The arms of victims jutted from the wreckage. Many who drowned in the inland ponds had been wearing wading boots when they died. Their bodies were floating upright in the water and had to be spotted by airplane. The search for family and friends went on.
That afternoon, we started looking for my friend who lived across the road. He was 4 months younger than me. And we couldn't find him anywhere, so there were firemen from Providence and Peacedale, Wakefield. Everyone was looking for bodies. And the storekeeper down at Sand Hill Cove, he had lost his life, and they were looking for him. But we were looking for the boy that was my age primarily, and they suggested we go get his dog. So my brother went and got his dog, and we started out where the bird sanctuary is now. And pretty soon the dog started digging. I wasn't in the immediate area at the time. I was farther away looking in another area, and the dog started digging, and the first thing he came to was the boy's hand. He was about 6 or 8 inches under the sand, completely buried. And if it hadn't been for the dog, I don't think we ever would have found him.
Many teenagers saw death for the first time that week when they helped to dig bodies from the salt ponds and wrecked houses. Dogs who had been tied during the storm had drowned or gone mad trying to free themselves. The death count climbed. 3 full days after the storm, between the morning and evening editions of the Providence Journal, 60 additional bodies were added to the count. By the end, nearly 700 victims were discovered throughout all of New England and New York, and over 300 of them were from Rhode Island. Narragansett Pier, a few miles north on the bay. Only the landmark towers remained of what had been a formidable granite seawall and road. The waves had taken both apart and strewn huge chunks of rubble across the hotel lawns. Houses were ripped apart, smashed, gutted, their contents spilled onto the road. Even though the National Guard had been mobilized in the morning, it had been a long, dark night for looters. What the waves had not carried away, these scavengers had. Further up the bay, tidy suburban communities, which used to enjoy a view of the water, now found their streets and yards filled with debris. And in Providence, all the wreckage in the world seemed to have come to rest. Barges wallowed in the river. Tugboats had been lifted high onto pilings, and lumber yards had floated away and redistributed themselves over the docks. Cars had tumbled into the river, and others were smashed and their occupants killed when walls collapsed on top of them. The roof of the train station had whistled away and come to rest here, a heap of twisted metal. Throughout the rest of the city, trees and cars and wires and houses lay in a tangle. Up the Blackstone River in Woonsocket, brick factories and stores had been bashed in, and this water tank showed how strong the wind had been. The smaller towns and villages in Massachusetts were wrecked, and one could follow the path of the storm northward by the trail of downed trees. The hurricane had roared through Vermont, weakening as it went, finally to blow itself out near Montreal. And in its wake in northern New England, thousands of acres of downed trees, hardwoods, softwoods, nearly 25% of the maple trees in New England down in windrows. It was estimated later that 40,000 deeds to woodland property would have to be resurveyed because their boundary trees were no longer standing. As often as these scenes of fallen trees are repeated, one has to remember that no one had ever seen anything like them anywhere before. The reason is simple. A major hurricane had never before struck an area with this kind of physical landscape. The picture postcard images of New England, quiet streets, stately old houses shaded by even older trees, all this was transformed overnight. The village greens, parks, and streets of the Northeast would not be the same again for generations. For some cities, the day after the storm, the trouble was only beginning. Swollen streams and rivers still ran at flood as their tributaries fed them. Rescue workers sculled through the flooded streets of Hartford like gondoliers as residents lounged and watched calmly from the tenements. There was nowhere to go. Barns had caved in from the wind, crushing poultry and herds of livestock. The rising water made castaways of those nimble enough to flee. Even as the water rose in the rivers, rebuilding and salvage had begun elsewhere. Boys and men picked gamely through the piles of debris looking for something salvageable. If the destruction was incalculable, so too was the fortitude one needed to face the job of clearing and hauling. It was a good time to own a roofing company, or a scrapyard, or a steam shovel. A radio, a bird cage, and a sewing machine. There was no logic to the objects one was left with by the storm, although just as often, there was the consolation of having saved something more sentimentally valuable. The region mobilized to help itself. Men long out of uniform took them up again as firemen, police, or rescue workers. In the fishing fleet, there was a remarkable new spirit of cooperation among the independent draggermen and longliners.
I think one of the good things that came from the hurricane, it sort of upgraded the fleet. The next morning they were all on bottom, and naturally they had to be raised and taken to a shipyard, but once they got into the shipyard, most of them fixed them up far better than they were before, and their engines were in better shape, so I think it helped the fleet in that respect. Another thing, I know it proved that a lot of fishermen, well, one bunch will work with another bunch, and at this time, no matter who was your friend, who was your enemy, everybody was always helping somebody else. The whole area would be working on one man's boat, and then they'd shift over and work on another man's boat. And the Red Cross provided some of the funds for the materials to fix these boats, so they didn't have any insurance in those days. They didn't know what insurance was. They couldn't afford it if they did know.
Yeah, before the hurricane, there was a lot of fish. There's much competition between the fishermen. I'd find a spot of fish, and then I'd put just a short flag above the surface, something I could see with my binoculars and no one else could see. And there was a lot of that, giving someone false tips. But that all ended with the hurricane. Everyone had banded together to recover, and from then on, you know, and then of course the government put these radio phones on our boat for defense purposes, you know, right? I mean, when the war came. So they'd call up, very wonderful cooperation, and they'd look out for one another.
There was help from the outside as well.
In 3 days, an army of 110,000 WPA workers had been shifted to emergency storm and flood duty. Every little man with a pick on this map represents 1,000 workers of the WPA. Manpower turning from regular public improvements and services into the breach in time of dire need. Where tracks remained to carry trains, thousands of these workers came by rail. Shock troops of disaster, someone has called them, because so many times in recent years they have provided the human sinews for great tasks of reconstruction.
The telephone companies faced enormous difficulties. No hurricane had ever hit an area as populated as this, nor one so crowded with industry. And never before had the problem of restoring service been tied up, literally, with thousands of downed trees. To the linemen, the fallen elms were an additional nuisance, but their loss was to be one of the most enduring of the storm. Most scars on the land would heal in time. In the western part of Rhode Island, however, one industry would be completely transformed.
During the 38 hurricane, we had millions of feet of it. These tall trees actually blown over by the heavy winds, but we had about 10 inches of rain, but uprooted all these stumps and everything there and blowed these trees down, crossed them up. And we had to go work and salvage them all up. When they were like this after the storm, it'd be probably 15, 20 foot high. Everything would be crossed up in all kinds of directions, and you'd have to climb up way up on the treetop somewhere and look over top of it. Be all messed up, crossed up always. So you'd have to start one end somewhere to get to it and be able, get the limbs off of it and pull it over and get down from the top. You start way up in the air, and sometimes you'd be up in the air 15 foot cutting logs up off the ground, trimming up. With them days, all you had was crosscut saws and axes. There was no chainsaws.
400 million board feet of timber down in Rhode Island, 1.5 billion board feet down in New Hampshire. After the storm, the government had moved in to salvage and buy virtually all the downed timber. And when piers and bulkheads and railroad ties and material for military bases were needed in 1941, the government had an enormous and fortuitous supply of lumber already stockpiled. For some people in the region, the memory of the 1938 storm has been eclipsed by another serious hurricane in 1954. But Ellery Thompson compares the two storms.
No comparison. I lived through the hurricane of Carol of 1954, where the boats got away from the dock, and they had a job, and the big seas combing up the harbor and everything. But you could walk around. It wasn't blowing any heavy automobiles overboard. And that was a picnic day, according to 1938. 1938, down there on the Stony waterfront and the Watchhill beaches, nothing could live. Cars, heavy cars blowing them right over like that until they went overboard. Houses carried right away. Oh, no. Nothing. I've seen a lot of gales in 40 years. Nothing compared with the 38. Don't let them tell you they can either.
Nevertheless, two hurricanes within 20 years prompted the state to consider ways to prevent more damage. In the early 60s, the United States Army Corps of Engineers constructed a massive hurricane barrier just south of the city of Providence. Santo Amato, Civil Defense Director for the state, is confident that the system of dikes, gates, and pumps will protect the city in another storm.
The Corps of Engineers, in their wisdom, have gone along the entire coast and tried to develop this type of barrier in the most potential areas that might be vulnerable to these storms. And I think they have done an exceptionally good job along this coast to prevent a similar situation that happened in 38. The barrier has been tested on a dry run type situation and also in a number of situations where the water was anticipated to cause a problem to the downtown area. And it worked. It worked exceptionally well in all instances. It had never been tested for the amount of water it's designed to remove or withhold. But according to the engineers and many other areas that have tested a similar type situation, it is and will work, we hope.
The Corps of Engineers had planned additional barriers to protect other areas of the state, but it seems unlikely that they will ever be built. The engineers built two large-scale models of the bay at their testing facilities in Vicksburg, Mississippi. Wind, wave, and tide conditions were then created in scale to simulate the storm surge of the 1938 hurricane. This is what happened to the Oakland Beach section of Warwick. To hurricane-proof one of the major bays in the Northeast, it was an audacious idea, even by the standards of the Corps of Engineers. Besides the complicated barrier at Fox Point in Providence, the Corps wanted to build 3 huge rubble breakwaters across the West Passage, the East Passage, and blocking the mouth of the Sakonnet River. First, they had to convince the Navy that the warships of the Atlantic Fleet based in Quonset and Newport could navigate through these breakwaters in high seas. The Corps had a more difficult time convincing residents of the area when public meetings were held. Not the least of the objections was the feeling many had that the Corps had underestimated the effect its mammoth breakwaters might have on the complex natural systems of the bay, not to mention its natural beauty. Another hurricane would find the people living south of the Providence hurricane barrier just as exposed as they were in 1938 and 1954. Their safety would depend on how prepared they would be to leave their homes and possessions behind and evacuate while they still had the chance. Neil Frank, the director of the National Hurricane Center in Miami, must cope with a problem in pragmatic terms.
Because we cannot forecast precisely where a hurricane is going to go, then we know that we must overwarn. We're going to tell you to take action more times than action is going to be required. Now, we estimate that every time we put a hurricane warning up, it's $25 million out-of-pocket cost to take the precautions. We do not put warnings up lightly. It's a very awesome decision to spend $25 million. So we're not going to warn you unless there is a threat. Now, underwarning, the error in underwarning is going to be measured in loss of life. We realize that overwarning is going to cost you dollars, but I'd a lot rather be on the overwarning side than the underwarning. In New England, we haven't had a major storm there now since 1960. Hurricane Donna moved across the eastern part of Long Island in 1960 and then on into the south coast of New England. So you see, that's been nearly 20 years ago, and a lot of people that have moved to the coastline since that storm. And new people coming to the coastline have a tendency not to really believe that things can be as bad as they can be in the 1938 storm. So it's difficult for us to get them to move sometimes and to take the precautions that are necessary in order to save their lives.
Do we believe that a hurricane may strike again? If one can judge from how quickly people have resettled most of the areas destroyed by the 1938 storm, the answer must be probably not. This is Charlestown Beach before the 1938 storm. This is Charlestown Beach after the hurricane. And this is Charlestown Beach today. These homes cost about $60,000 on the average, but no protection is guaranteed, even from normal weather. A homeowner may return here in the summer to find that the winter seas have made some unplanned alterations to the size of his lot or the inclination of his house. For geologist John Fisher of the University of Rhode Island, the barrier beaches are a laboratory. Last year, he and his students discovered a remarkable relic of the hurricane's passing, a layer of coarse sand and large pebbles laid down on the beaches when the storm leveled them 40 years ago.
That's the layer of the 38 hurricane in there. And this tight, flat, discoid waves came across the beach, just simply carried it over and deposited it on top of the dunes. And then this is built up since then. Right down there is where we found the pebbles is also the coarse sand layer. And that coarse sand here was deposited by the hurricane. For the Rhode Island coast and for the Northeast, it gives us a measure of how much a dune will build up after an erosional phase, such as the hurricane. Because we can divide the 20 or so years between the 38 hurricane and the 54 hurricane, between the 54 hurricane and the height now at 78, and come out how many inches are built up each year naturally. Houses would not allow the dune grass to grow under the houses, and in many cases the houses are so close together that there's no room between the houses for dune grass to grow. And so when the waves come in, they simply attack the front of the cliff, cut back the scarp, and the houses fall in. Now in the case of a natural dune such as this, sure, there's some undercutting, there's some slumping, but the sand essentially remains here, and then the sand also comes in from the beach where it's been carried out during the storm waves. The onshore winds, such as we're having today, moves the sand on top of the dune. The dune grass is still there. It grows up